Welcome to the Musicians Weekly, Volume 29. Is the writing of fugues after Johann Sebastian Bach an academic task, a scholastic way of composing something conservative and impersonal in the negative sense? Many people think that fugues are something old-fashioned, and basically most of the time they are. And so how did the fugue develop after Bach? First of all, in a way, it didn't develop. Bach made the model of the real fugue, and afterwards everything had changed with that. So before Bach it was the Reger, mainly of Girolamo Frescobaldi, who was the great predecessor of Bach, just one century before him. And we all know that in the bookshelves of Johann Sebastian Bach there was the score of Frescobaldi's Fiori Musicali in partiture a quattro. This also brings another interesting task to the fore. There was this discussion, what is the music written for? Fiori Musicali or later Art of the Fugue, Kunst der Fuge by Bach. Because it was basically organ music. So in Frescobaldi's case, it's very clear, it's organ music, but it's written out in 4 systems to show the counterpoint in the most instructive and clear manner. But at that time, the music didn't depend on a particular kind of instrumentarium. Most of the music, at least. And so in this case, it was absolutely clear that it could be also played by an ensemble. Best case of instruments of similar kind of sound production, like in a choir. So this wrong thinking about counterpoint is clearer, the more different the kind of sound of each instrument is. It's not true. It brings in other elements, and of course, for the superficial impression, it seems that it's very clear this voice is played by an oboe, this voice is played by a horn, this one is played by a violin, and this one by a trombone. Okay, so it seems obvious, but it's not so easy to follow as if you have 4 same kind of instruments, for same family. Of course, then you have to phrase every voice in the way its energy flows in the movement. But then, when the phrasing is clear, independent phrasing of each voice in interconnection, it becomes much easier to follow. Because the extra impression of the different colors is not there, it's purer. And so you can follow much easier. And of course, as Glenn Gould showed and many other pianists after and even before him, and the piano, it can be very clear with counterpoint, thanks to phrasing, like also Murray Pereira showed us, or Daniel Barenboim, many. So this is the first thing. And the second thing is, at that time, the instrumentarium didn't really count. You can play it on the organ, or you can play it on a trombone ensemble, or you can play it on a string ensemble, or whatever, in Frescobaldi's case. Same in Johann Sebastian Bach's case with the Kunst der Fuge. But here we have these, mainly the harpsichordists think, no, it's written for the harpsichord, even not for the organ. So even if they are right that it was played on a harpsichord, the harpsichord is much worse suited to this kind of music than the organ, and even worse than singers or instruments that can really phrase. Anyhow, Bach created the model of the fugue in the well-tempered piano, in many other pieces, in his organ fugues, and of course in the Art of the Fugue, and so on. What came after him? First, the fugue was out of fashion when the pre-classical period was there with the Mannheim school and with Gluck and with all these things. There was no interest in the fugue. There were fugues, of course, but it was definitely a sign of old style. Joseph Haydn used it in his string quartets mainly, but also in the symphonies, the fugue techniques, so he took it up again. And of course Mozart made it something fantastic in the later years. It's incredible what Mozart made out of the fugue. He renewed in a way Bach's style, and then came Beethoven. And Beethoven was really revolutionary with the fugue. So in his case, the fugue is no sign of conservatism or academicism, but he breaks with the formal rules of the fugue, of course. So particularly in the great fugue for string quartet or string orchestra, which sounds better for a string orchestra. And of course, the große Fuge, and of course in the fugue of the Hammerklavier sonata. You have totally unconventional fugues with a really revolutionary appeal. Schubert also was starting to try such things. Then he wanted to study with Sechter, but he died immediately afterwards. So he wrote very beautiful counterpoint, but we will not mention him so much as a fugue composer. There is not so much fugue there. But then came Mendelssohn. And young Mendelssohn, we can say that what came late for Mozart came very early for Mendelssohn to write fugues. And there are some fantastic fugues in the string symphonies, for example. For me, the climax of this development is so-called 13th string symphony, which it isn't. It's just one movement. It's also not a symphonic movement. It's one movement for strings, and it's an introduction in the style of the French overture, and then a fugue. And it's the instrumentation of Lully with 2 violins, 2 violas, and cello and double bass. Quintet setting, which is totally unusual for the time. It comes from Lully, and the Lullists like Muffat or Kusser, and then it vanished, and it was taken up by Mendelssohn. We don't know who brought him to the quintet setting. I doubt whether it even was Zelter. Maybe he found some scores somewhere. He could not have got it from Bach and not from one of his immediate predecessors. And after him, it vanished again. It vanished totally. So anyhow, we have a phenomenal fugue there in Mendelssohn's case, and it's also a revolutionary fugue because, of course, he doesn't break with the rules so obviously. But suddenly, after the climax, and the climax, he brings the inversion of the theme directly after the climax. And then there comes a passage where the theme is still there, but everything is piano, and it is like already kind of Midsummer Night's Dream figurations out of fugue for some 20 seconds or whatever, and then the fugue returns with vehemence. But in the end, suddenly all the parts unite to a paraphonic melody, and then even in unison in the end. This unison, you can say, he got from Johann Sebastian Bach, D minor piano concerto, for example, or of course also from Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach in his symphonies. Anyhow, this fugue is very revolutionary for the time, as are many things by young Mendelssohn. Then we have the fugue with Robert Schumann. It's very much oriented toward Bach, but very obsessive in its way. It's in its use of, like Schumann always was, very obsessive in its use of thematic material, and also his totally own approach. So we have this Schumannesque fugue writing, which is not very strong counterpoint in a way, but anyhow it reminds in a way of Bach, but it's also not academic. And when we come to the fugue, in the case of Wagner, we have Meistersinger, but this is not really fugue, but it is fantastic counterpoint in the Meistersinger, and in many things, like we have in Falstaff by Verdi. So, you know, they all studied the fugue technique and then used it in their own way. But then it becomes interesting with Bruckner. I mean, he was in a way the master of academicism, and even at the same time of transcending it. We speak about the final fugue in the Fifth Symphony, but it is so much out of fugue normality of fugue tradition. So it's not really a fugue. It is built on the fugue technique. And other pieces, like, for example, the string quintet, there is no fugue there. It's free counterpoint. He learned from writing fugues. And that's very interesting because he's not the only composer. I mean, Bruckner basically uses fugue technique only in his sacred music. Really fugues. And the other thing is derived from fugue technique. Then we have other composers who also take away any even far impression of fugue writing, like Sibelius. He was a fantastic counterpoint composer in his totally free way of letting harmonies collide and overlap and all these things, like earthquakes of harmonic collision. But he would never write a fugue. In Sibelius, in all his orchestral music, in his at least mature chamber music, there are no fugues. He doesn't need it. And very interesting, also a composer like Martin Scherber, born in 1907, died in 1974, who wrote these phenomenal symphonies number 2 and 3 with a lot of counterpoint, with derived everything from one thematic cell, like in The Art of the Fugue by Bach. Not one moment of fugue. In the third symphony by Scherber, you have some canonic things in the Aquarius movement. Everything is in one movement, but it's the 12 movements in one movement. And in this pre-final movement, you have some canonic writing. But Scherber never uses the fugue. And so many people consider now the fugue as something academic and something old-fashioned and something like, you recur on the fugue technique when you have no ideas, when the fantasy is not in free flow, when you just want to write something of secure form and of clear structure and so on, but being basically dull and conservative. But when you look, for example, to a piece like the first orchestra suite by Tschaikowsky, this first movement, which is a lot of fugue writing, it's also fantastic. It's the typical Tschaikowsky in fugue form. So, or in fugue manner, better said. It's not a really fugue form. So also in that case, it's not academic. But of course, we have composers where you find academicism, definitely. So if you take the really phenomenal Swedish composer Wilhelm Stenhammar, he uses a lot of fugue technique, for example, in the final movement of his second symphony, or also in Sangen, in his really phenomenal last major magnum opus for chorus and orchestra. There is a lot of fugue technique, and in a way, in Stenhammar's music, you can find it is music very much bound in the tradition. And lots of his music maybe sometimes have a freer kind of breathing when there is not so much fugue, like in the third string quartet by Stenhammar. And I personally, for example, I prefer the first movement or the second movement of his second symphony to the final movement with this rigid fugue. Phenomenal technical demonstration. In the case of Max Reger, we also have a very traditional approach. But what is different from tradition? It is so extremely chromatic. So even the themes, if you take the theme of his Mozart variations, Fugue, the theme already is very long and very chromatic. So you don't keep it in mind when you are in the fugue development. So the whole theme is too long for a fugue development. In the beginning, it is very pretty and works when the first, second, third, fourth voice come in. No problem. It is kind of even humoristic. Same we have in the Hiller variations, in the Beethoven variations, in the Bach variations, in the Telemann variation. We have all these variation cycles by Reger, where he normally uses to have a fugue in the end. Here, of course, for the organ, for string quartet, we have a lot of fugue things in Reger's music, but he works in a very strange kind. His music is by itself not very academic because of the very radical kind of chromaticism he always uses. I mean, so much chromaticism which goes against the domination of melody, because melody is always taken with the harmony. So melody becomes chromatic, melody becomes less melodic, we can say finally. It is the harmony that leads and the melody that follows. And this is then more harmonic music than counterpoint music. That's basically what we have in Reger. What limits him as a counterpoint composer. He is absolutely professional and scholastically fantastic in counterpoint, but the harmony is dominating. And so this is what distinguishes Reger from the fugue tradition. If you go back to the Reger by Frescobaldi or the Kunst der Fuge by Bach, they don't need any modulation even. And I mean, the fugue starts before this. Fugue starts with the old Netherlands school and with Palestrina. I mean, this kind of imitating movement of the so-called classical vocal polyphony, another use of the word classical than classical period. This was laid the foundation of the fugue. And so the fugue basically also is vocal music. But then we have the instrumental fugue that comes out of that with the well-tempered piano, very obviously. And in Mendelssohn, in the string works and so on. We have Mozart in the Jupiter Symphony. All this is then instrumental counterpoint, instrumental fugue. But always in the back, there stays the vocal idea of voice leading, which is mainly something coming from vocal music. So, and this is the archaic root of the fugue. And to this we can always come back. Composers can always come back to that. I mean, today many composers have no idea anymore at all about counterpoint technique, which is a real pity, because it's not only leading to traditional writing, to conventional writing, it also leads you to really understand composition as a technique. And if you compose without technique, which I would say mainly if you don't really study harmony and counterpoint, you don't have real composition technique. And without technique, you can invent a lot of things, but you will always lack this basic craft. So I can only say today, composers should always learn these things again. Then we have the fugue with Hindemith, for example. And now some things are very traditional, but other things like the whole free tonal harmony is completely untraditional. So it's this kind of strange mixture, like before in Reger's music, who influenced Hindemith to a quite high degree. It's a very strange mixture of something old style and something completely new style. Then we have also fugues in dodecaphonic music. Of course, you don't realize, very often people don't realize that it's a fugue at all, because if you don't have developed some technical approach to listening, you will find it just interesting without knowing what happens, because the melodies are not anymore this kind of remarkable in themselves. So you don't get them, because 12th tone never creates a melody as clear as a normal fugue theme. But then you have a lot of fugue composers in every nation, everywhere, who are very traditional or even who are anachronistic. Of course we have them. But the fantastic thing is that just recently, some 2 years ago, I heard for the first time the name of Benjamin Attahir, a French composer born in 1989, a French composer of Moroccan and Lebanese origin. And he wrote this string quartet Al-Asr, which is phenomenally played on record, and also phenomenally played in concert by the Quatuor Arod. And he writes a final fugue in this quartet. It's 5 movements in one, this quartet. And fugue team is already there very shortly after the beginning of the piece, but in the end we have this fugue, which is totally revolutionary and which really breaks all the dams of tradition. And so this Barbaro Arrabbiata fugue in the end of this quartet is, I would say, as revolutionary in its approach to fugue as was Beethoven. And so this is proof for me again that you can use all kinds of technical means. And it is fantastic if you have the technique and you can make with it whatever you want. So there is wonderful fugue writing in Edmund Rubbra, for example, Rubbra. By the way, Rubbra or Rubbra? When there is a documentary about Gustav Holst and they interview him and they speak about Edmund Rubbra. So I would prefer Rubbra. But even the daughter of Bernard Stevens, I spoke with her. She told me that people pronounce it in different ways. So in Edmund Rubbra, who wrote also a very fine counterpoint book and got all this counterpoint knowledge from Holst, who was a fantastic counterpoint composer. Many people don't know, but you can hear it when you hear his music. Rubbra wrote this free-flowing counterpoint in fugue style, which is wonderful, particularly in his late symphonies number 10 and 11. It's a kind of free-flowing counterpoint. It goes back to pre-Baroque music, to the Renaissance music, which influenced, and then we have Peter Mennin from the US, greatest symphonist US Americans ever had. A phenomenal modern fugue writer, for example, in his string quartet number 2 or in his symphonies. It's absolutely unbelievable, which means a kind of zest for life, of intensity, of vehemence. He writes these irresistibly forward urging fugues. And then you have Roy Harris, also American composer, also writing very interesting, very fine fugues. So the fugue has, like the symphony, not at all come to its end. And I basically have to disagree if people say the fugue is dead. It's just something outdated. And there are also bad fugues, a lot of bad fugues in contemporary music, where people write in a fugue style, atonally or tonally also sometimes, and have no idea about the dynamic process in the fugue. So it's just only a procedure that comes from the outside and that doesn't get inside the dynamics of a fugue. Since Bach, we know that the fugue has its own dynamism, which is irresistible. And this can be in congruence basically with any kind of style, of harmonic style. And so I am very thankful if you, in the comments you give me, or in the emails you give me some more hints. I forgot a lot of things, I'm sure, as always, to mention. But for example, Heinz Thiessen wrote fantastic fugato music in his string quintet, which has not been recorded to date. And so we have lots of expressionists also who write phenomenally in fugue style. Max Putting in his little pieces for string quartet, it is absolutely fantastic and can be wonderfully combined with Bach's Art of the Fugue pieces. And so then of course we have the composers from Russia like Boris Tishenko or Sergei Slonimsky, writing whole cycles with fugues and Rodion Chetrin and so on. Not everything is of the same phenomenal architecture, and not everything is the same inventive, interesting, and spontaneous in its final result. But we can study a lot of it, and we have, of course, we will find always this kind of knife edge between tradition and something really new. Glazunov was a traditional counterpoint composer, a traditional fugue writer, for example. But still, the music has its charm. But I would say that in Glazunov's case, the fugue writing is not the most original he has to offer. There are composers where this is different. See you soon next time with one more of these unorthodox views on music.